All right, gang, you're stuck with just us today, just Amy and I. I say that because I feel like we've been doing a lot of really awesome guest episodes this season, Amy, and I'm super pumped for our listeners to get to hear some of those episodes that are forthcoming.
I
Um,
know. Super
this
exciting.
this is the first time we've just recorded just the two of us in a little while here, but what better than to get back into the swing of our single nutrient series? And we're going to talk about humble old vitamin B5, pantothenic acid.
Woo!
So, to kick it to the RD in the group, B5, important? Yeah.
Very important. I think, again, to sort of piggyback on some of the other episodes, like B5 is very important for energy metabolism. So, making ATP from the food we eat, making energy from the food we eat is like probably still maybe one of the biggest things it might be known for. So again, it's going to be important for making energy, just like B1 thiamine, B2 riboflavin, and B3 niacin, which we've already covered, to kind of pull those into things. I feel like it's a nutrient. We were talking before we started, and then we were like, oh, we better start. I feel like it's a little bit of a weird, odd nutrient because it's just kind of assumed. I even remember when we were learning about it back in the day, and that the heyday of my nutrition school, us being like, oh, no one's ever deficient in this thing. Like, oh, we're not even going to cover this in that much depth because everyone's going to have B5 if they're eating. So I think that there's a lot of like maybe studies on severe deficiency and like what that looks like. But I actually don't think that there's as much data around like subclinical deficiency. And that's where things get, I think, a little bit squirrely because a lot of the maybe signs of deficiency are really common. And like in our patient population too, who might be under eating in general, could be low in B5 as well.
You make a good point. And that was basically the tone from my nutrition classes as well, is that you almost don't have to worry about B5 because the name pantothenic acid comes from the Greek word pantos, which means everywhere or from everywhere. So kind of the assumption is that this vitamin is found in all food. So you're going to be able to get it through the diet kind of no matter what. And because of that, we don't really have a lot of research studies with isolated nutritional deficiencies in the single nutrient. Versus like we could isolate and say, oh, if we look at a population that does not eat seafood and does not use iodized salt, we could like isolate iodine deficiency, right? Or if we look at vegans, we could see potentially like an isolated zinc or a B12 deficiency. But with B5, it is a little tricky because you can get it from plant-based and animal-based sources to some degree, but you're hitting the nail on the head. It's like, does that mean that we don't need to care about it? Does that mean that we don't need to have a conversation about it? There are a lot of plausible mechanisms that we can get into that may or may not suggest a subclinical deficiency or like an insufficiency in the diet. And getting more B5 might not be a bad idea for a lot of our listeners, especially as we start getting into some of these mechanisms. So maybe a good one to start with, which you mentioned, is energy production and how this is one of the nutrients that's especially important for the Krebs cycle and making ATP. And, you know, I think I'll kick it to you for the gut related stuff, but I'm going to say right out the gate, a lot of our patients suffer with brain fog and fatigue. And it sort of makes you wonder if there could be some B vitamin insufficiencies that play into those two symptoms. Not necessarily, you know, candida or leaky gut or whatever people are thinking. It might just be that you're not getting enough B vitamins, maybe including B5. But do you want to speak to like how important ATP might be for gut health specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when you're talking about energy, like we need so much energy to fuel all of gut function. We need, in terms of even making digestive juices and releasing the digestive juices, we need ATP for that. the gut turns over a lot. So you're going to be needing a lot of energy to maintain the intestinal barrier. So again, and I think another big one too, more specifically to B5, is that it's needed to make acetylcholine, which is needed for motility purposes. So
the neurotransmitter of the vagus nerve.
Right.
And we talk an awful lot about the vagus nerve here.
Exactly. It's not, and again, not even necessarily just for motility, for digestive function in general. If you want to keep that nerve happy and healthy and functioning well, we want to be making enough acetylcholine to fuel gut function and motility and all those sorts of things. And again, you're not going to be able to make that if we don't have enough B5. I think, interestingly enough, another aspect too, just from a broad, what you were talking about, like the broad symptoms, insomnia is another one. Like I hear people blaming, Candida or SIBO causing their insomnia, or kind of blaming some other things for their insomnia. B5's needed to convert serotonin into melatonin. So again, it can lead to things like insomnia as well. And again, there's some other kind of general stuff too, like wound healing, skin health, that sort of stuff that can be attributed to B5. And I like that you were saying, I think it's very easy just with the internet to say like, this brain fog is because of Candida, but it's much harder and not done often to take a step back and be like, oh, wait, maybe the more obvious thing is that I'm not necessarily getting the nutrition I need to facilitate energy, sleep, that sort of thing. I feel like, again, it's very easy to make these connections that are probably less of an issue, if an issue at all.
Well, it reminds me of that saying in school that they tell you. They say, if you hear hooves, look for horses, not zebras. But we all like the shiny. We all like the sexy stuff. So we all get excited and we look for the zebras right away. And we all maybe fathom that we're like zebra tamer extraordinaire over here. But realistically, at least it's certainly in North America, if you hear hooves, it is probably horses, not zebras. And this is a good example of that, of like, it's much, much, much more likely that you're missing out on a nutrient needed to make ATP or a nutrient needed to run your nervous system versus, Candida. And I will say too, remember that the brain and the nervous system is super energy piggish. It's a hog. And I forget the exact numbers, but I've seen them thrown around of like, the brain only makes up something like 3% of our body weight, but it hogs up something like 20% of our oxygen and our glucose supply. And there's a reason it sucks up all that glucose. It's because your brain needs to make ATP from that glucose. So you could kind of loosely translate that to the brain, this little, 3% of your body weight bowl of mush is hogging up about 20% of your ATP production. So whenever you hear like energy production and, these B vitamins and the Krebs cycle and that sort of stuff, you really should be thinking about your nervous system and then ultimately the gut-brain axis.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that B5 is needed to make the neurotransmitter of the vagus nerve, which makes it especially important for gut-brain axis function.
Right. For sure. Yeah, I think, there are a few other things to think about too. I know it's important for making like hemoglobin, which kind of transports oxygen to tissues, which could also affect the brain. It could also affect energy, fatigue type stuff. But yeah, I think, like I said, that the studies where they like are heavily deficient are kind of interesting too. From a gut standpoint, what they typically would see in more heavily deficient populations is nausea, like gas, so like farting more, You're going to potentially even see throwing up, like in more like severely deficient stuff. And again, that's probably has a couple of different big mechanisms. But, you know, if your nervous system in general doesn't have this nutrient, one, the vagus nerve might not work as well. But two, again, maybe you're not making ATP. Like there's all these kind of, maybe your body's more in a budget mode with ATP. It can't use as much and things suffer. But there are kind of documented gut related things that happen in the severely deficient state that are interesting, that could be related to kind of like slow motility, just worse functioning overall, not enough ATP to work well.
Well, certainly when you say, you know, nausea and potentially even vomiting, that makes me think of like delayed gastric emptying and possibly even gastroparesis,
Right.
which is a flavor of dysmotility. I know like the folks that we work with usually are paying a lot more attention to the migrating motor complex, which is in the small bowel. But, you know, gastric emptying, stomach emptying is another flavor of motility. And those symptoms scream delayed gastric emptying to me. So again, it starts making you wonder if, you know, poor vagal function, poor acetylcholine release makes it so that you can't run your motility correctly. And then you're getting these symptoms of delayed stomach emptying as a consequence of this deficiency.
Right. For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I think in terms of like some other things that we haven't mentioned too about pantothenic acid is it's important for the synthesis of different hormones. For cortisol, it's important for the synthesis of vitamin A and vitamin D. So again, like it does, and again, it's important for moisturizing skin, kind of like creating healthy skin. Like there are kind of different things, wound healing, it can be important for. So if there's kind of issues with skin health, I might kind of, oh, that's interesting. Again, I'd look at your nutrition as a whole. I feel like we've mentioned that before in the other episodes. Like, I don't know if I'd go like, oh, it's just a B5 thing. It might be like just generally, but you know,
using a single nutrient supplement like a medication is probably not the answer. But you know, there are some studies, like there are studies using basically vitamin B5 supplements in cardiovascular disease, and it can help like lower LDL and help with lipids and glucose. So it's not that single B5 supplements wouldn't be helpful for certain situations. And it might even help with fatty liver disease. But interestingly, I'll throw this out here. Hold on, let me be a dork. Bust out my textbook, which I have highlighted and prepared for today's episode. But one of the things that stood out to me right out the gate when I was highlighting this is that, as you mentioned briefly, you need a lot of your vitamin B5 is going toward creating something called coenzyme A or CoA. And then that is what a lot of these functions are attributed to. It's the CoA that you make from pantothenic acid. And CoA is most abundant in the liver, adrenal glands, kidneys, brain, and heart. So that kind of suggests to me that those are the tissues that would suffer the most in a state of deficiency. So again, nervous system, brain, we just talked about that. Heart, I briefly mentioned that there's some research using B5 supplements in cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But also the liver, like the liver and the gut are very much connected. Hold on, where's my painting? Right there.
Oh yeah, look at that. I don't think I've ever noticed that.
Yeah, those two are connected with the blood vessels, but you know, the gut and the liver are very intimately connected, both because the liver is producing bile and then dumping it into the GI tract, but also everything that comes up from the gut and gets absorbed has to pass through the checkpoint at the liver first before it gets to go to systemic circulation. And so the liver is really responsive to whatever is going on in the gut. And, you know, there is some research using B5 supplements for fatty liver disease. So it really makes you think that there there could be a connection there as well.
Yeah, no, super cool. Yeah, I think, you know, do we want to dive into maybe people that might be a little bit more at risk for?
Yeah, I think that would be good. And then remind me if I forget, I want to talk about other nutrients and their interaction with B5 because I have a little bit kind of prepared and highlighted on that topic as well.
Cool.
But yeah, let's paint a picture of what sort of populations might be at higher risk or like what symptoms might be associated with that. And while you're saying that, I'm going to keep my headphones on, but I'm going to step over to the side and grab my Nutribor book because I want to reference that table that I brought up before in the series.
Yeah, for sure.
So take it away, Amy.
I'm really on the spot now, but I think that in terms of symptoms, we've kind of already talked about that, most of them, like fatigue, insomnia. There could be some mood changes, like depression. I think there can definitely be some GI related stuff that comes up, like nausea, wound healing stuff, poor recovery from certain things would be maybe the biggies that I would think about. Skin stuff. I think in terms of people that might be at high risks, it seems like in the studies, one of the biggest risk factors would be alcohol. It kind of reminds me of like maybe B1, how B1 gets really depleted with alcohol intake. B5 definitely is one that, you know, can be, it can lead to deficiency if you're over imbibing. So cut that out if you are doing that. I don't know how much I don't know how much of our patients are typically over imbibing, but if you're drinking a little bit heavily, that certainly is kind of very anti B5. And you know, I would cut that out just in general. There'd probably be multiple reasons. Not to say like having a drink here or there is problematic, but if you're overdoing it, could be problematic. I think one thing to think about is people that are on more of a keto-based diet. This is something I wasn't super familiar with, but it makes sense. Chris Masterjohn has like a nice series where you can watch like videos about each individual nutrient. And one thing he pointed out was that if you're eating more of like a keto or higher fat diet, you're going to be using a little bit more B5. So like your needs go up a little bit. It's not like a crazy amount. I think he said like maybe 20%. Okay. But that's something to kind of keep in mind too. You might need a little bit more on a higher fat diet. If you're eating like a very heavily processed diet, that could potentially, I mean, that raises your needs for maybe a lot of nutrients, but B5 being one of them. One thing too, when I was looking at Chris Masterjohn's video too, I know he was talking about how like a lot of the databases used raw items, and B5 is actually fairly sensitive to heat. So like something like maybe 70% of the B5 gets destroyed by heat. So we're not really able to extract it very well. So, I mean, potentially someone that's eating like all cooked foods. I don't know if there's tons of people out there, but that could maybe raise your risk of B5 deficiency, or like B5 subclinical issues. I think gut stuff could potentially play a role a bit. This is like a nutrient that's harder to absorb than a lot of the other Bs. It has to be kind of activated in the gut to be absorbed. It's something like we only absorb about 50% of it. So if there's anyone with like bigger GI related issues, I would say definitely like an IBD situation, celiac, that sort of, I maybe IBS in severe forms, but definitely kind of in the IBD probably realm. You might be someone that could develop some deficiencies here just from like an absorption standpoint.
Blatant cases of malabsorption.
Right.
And, you know, you could kind of think about that as if your conventional GI doctor has diagnosed you with malabsorption, then you might think about this a bit more versus, frankly, if your functional doctor or your naturopath
Right.
has casually thrown around the idea of malabsorption because SIBO causes malabsorption, then like I probably wouldn't sweat it quite as much. But, if you have villus atrophy from celiac disease, or if you have, IBD, then this could be on the table. And that was one of the things that came up as I was reading about this too, is that a single nutrient deficiency is not super common for vitamin B5, but it can co-occur with multiple nutrient deficiencies, like what would happen with Crohn's or celiac disease or something like that.
Right.
And to briefly just share something too, and we've said this in the series before, but I'm going to reiterate it also, is that before you jump to the malabsorption assumption, you have to do some nutrition tracking. I don't care what your blood work shows. I don't care, symptomatically, like look to see if you're actually eating the damn thing first before you start jumping to the malabsorption thing. Because we've seen this a bajillion times and it makes us want to tear our hair out. We've seen people who are like, oh, my functional doctor, my naturopath says that I have a really tough case of SIBO and it's stealing all my nutrients and I have malabsorption because my B12 is low or my iron is low. But then when you actually have them do tracking, it just turns out that they're not eating B12 or they're not eating iron. And it's really not a mystery why their levels are low. So just always remember that, to do some tracking, either on your own with an app like Chronometer, hashtag not sponsored, but it should be, or maybe working one-on-one with a dietitian and doing some more in-depth analysis with a dietitian, and do that first before you jump to the conclusion of malabsorption.
Yeah, I would say like 95% of the time when someone comes to me and says, oh, I have outright malabsorption, I need support to fix the malabsorption, we do nutrition analyses, and you're right. There's a gap that we need to fill. Like, it makes sense.
You're not eating it, bro.
Right. So that's a really good point. I'm glad that you're reminding everybody to do that
Insufficient intake
first.
Until proven otherwise.
Exactly. One other thing that I also didn't know, and having just recently before this jumped on Chris Masterjohn's one-on-one video he had on pantothenic acid, he did say that pregnancy, like at some point in pregnancy, like pantothenic acid gets majorly like depleted. Which again, like I'm sure there's other nutrients like that, but it just makes me wonder, maybe that's like one of the reasons why you're so tired during different parts of pregnancy, where it's like that little nugget of a baby is leaching all your nutrients.
That mooch.
Yeah, mooch and everything. But yeah, I think probably the biggest risk would be like, are you just too narrow in your diet or under eating, or kind of just your nutrition's off in general, leading to a lot of maybe deficiencies, including pantothenic acid.
And like you said, highly processed diets in particular could stand a risk for this, but also we've seen this before where people stack multiple restrictive diets where they're like, oh, I'm paleo and vegan and low FODMAP and whatever. And it's, the more you stack the restrictive diets, the more likely it is that you're going to have problems from it. So, for example, I'm just going to borrow from the Nutrivore website. On her website for vitamin B5, she says, although small amounts are present in a wide variety of foods, the richest sources of pantothenic acid include organ meats, especially liver and kidneys, red meat, shellfish, oily fish, dairy products, eggs, lentils and other legumes, mushrooms, avocados, seeds, especially sunflower seeds and flax seeds, whole grains, and sweet potatoes. And if you think about that list, there are numerous reasons why people would demonize large chunks of that list. So like if you're vegan, there goes organ meat, red meat, shellfish, fish, dairy, eggs off the chopping block. If you're doing paleo, there goes the lentils, legumes, whole grains, etc. If you're doing low FODMAP, there goes the lentils, legumes, dairy, mushrooms, avocados, and some of the whole grains, and sweet potatoes, I guess, too. So there's a lot of potential to hack this out of your diet, even though it is found in everything to some degree.
Right.
You might not be getting enough to fuel your body and fuel your brain and your metabolism and your immune system and your gut lining and your liver. And I don't want people to underplay the importance of this nutrient or just kind of write it off because they think that nobody's deficient in it.
Right. It's in everything, but if you've cut everything out, that's problematic.
Exactly. Yeah. Touche. That's actually a good way to put it. Well, and just because there's a small amount in everything, that doesn't mean that all of those teeny tiny small amounts is going to add up to something useful for your body. You still need to get above some like critical mass to function. And you need to do that every day or most days of your life.
Right.
So
for sure.
Yeah. So it's tricky business. I will share too, if I may segue into what I wanted to share, which is there are some nutrient interactions with B5 to keep in mind. So for example, and again, I actually didn't realize this until I was poking around on the Nutrivore website too. But she points out that if you take B5 or B7 in high enough doses, they can compete with each other for absorption because they both use the same transporter in the gut. So it's here. So hold on, let me actually just read it. So it says, B5 has the potential, especially at high doses, to compete with biotin for uptake in the cells and in the intestines due to both of these nutrients using the sodium-dependent multivitamin transporter. And, that could be an issue for B5. Again, maybe if somebody was taking high-dose B5 for cardiovascular or metabolic or fatty liver kind of purposes. But it makes me think there are a lot of people who take high-dose biotin.
Yeah, for hair.
Right? Like hair, skin, nails. I've seen a lot of people, especially women, who are taking, like a hair, skin, nail type formula, and it has a shit ton of biotin in it. And not only can that artificially screw with your thyroid labs, and you need to be mindful when you get your thyroid labs drawn, but also it could potentially inhibit your B5 absorption if you're not careful. So I thought that was a really useful one to point out, especially with how common biotin supplements are.
Yeah, for sure.
Another one here is that, so as I mentioned, the claim to fame for vitamin B5 is less about the vitamin itself and more that we use this vitamin to make coenzyme A. But that reaction, taking vitamin B5 and turning it into CoA, takes energy and some nutrients and some effort. So two that came up, again, I'm just going to be a dork and read from my book here, is the synthesis of coenzyme A starts with the rate-limiting phosphorylation of pantothenic, yada, 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 and it requires ATP and magnesium for that first reaction. Then the next reaction requires cysteine, which is an amino acid.
Yeah.
So we get into this territory of, okay, maybe you don't want to have a shit ton of biotin floating around, inhibiting your absorption potentially, but also you probably need enough magnesium and enough cysteine to take this vitamin and turn it into the thing that we ultimately want and the thing that's ultimately going to do what you want it to do. And hold on. I put this down because it didn't mention B5 specifically, but according to the prevalent of nutritional insufficiencies from this table on page 10 of the Nutrivore book, about 66.3% of the American public is deficient in magnesium.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And then I will share, I know protein is kind of the it girl right now on social media, but there still are a pretty fair number of people who are coming up shy on protein. And I personally noticed when I was not eating dairy or when I was eating very little dairy as part of my protein intake, I noticed that my cysteine intake was chronically low. And I did a whole 30-minute YouTube video all about glutathione, and I did fancy schmancy Nutrival testing, and I was able to show that my glutathione was a bit low. And then I took N-acetylcysteine, which is basically just a supplement with this amino acid in it. I took N-acetylcysteine, and then down the road, I retested my glutathione and it was normal. But I could have ascertained that same information from Chronometer, and I could have looked and seen, oh, my cysteine intake is low. Like, out of all the amino acids that I need to eat, that's the one that was a bit low on me. And I could have just put 2 and 2 together without the $380 Nutrival.
Right.
But anyway, my point, I guess, is that I can't be the only person on Earth who's under consuming cysteine. And I think probably if you're not eating dairy, or if you're kind of undershooting your protein needs, it wouldn't surprise me if you don't have a lot of cysteine. And then that could potentially affect vitamin B5 and your ability to utilize it, and your ability to make things like acetylcholine and hormones and make repairs.
Right. For sure. Very
the tangled
true.
web we weave, Amy.
It's honestly true. Honestly true.
It is. But I'm trying to think. I think that might be most of what I wanted to share about B5. Do you think? I hate to make this a shorter episode because, again, I don't want people to think that this is an unimportant nutrient. But I think that was a lot of what I wanted to discuss. Maybe one more, actually, if I may. I had a slide pulled up from one of the things I teach my students in FODMAP Freedom. And so this I thought might be worth sharing as well. So there's a paper that I shared with them titled Metabolism of Dietary and Microbial Vitamin B Family in the Regulation of Host Immunity. And 2 of the things that I took out of there that I wanted to share is it says, like vitamins B1 and B2, B5 is involved in the control of host immunity via energy generation by immune cells. Yeah, every cell of your body needs energy, needs ATP, and B5 is super duper important for that. But we haven't really talked a lot about the immune system yet. Your immune system also needs energy to fight the bad guys, including but not limited to the bad guys in your gut like Candida. So,
right.
It's like you can take all of the antimicrobials on planet Earth, but if your immune system is suppressed or inefficient, then you're going to find yourself stuck on those antimicrobials. But they also go on to say, in terms of immune response, vitamin B5 enhances protective immunity against Mycobacterium tuberculosis infection by promoting innate immunity and adaptive immunity. So that's kind of neat. Obviously, I don't think that a lot of our listeners have tuberculosis, but it just kind of paints this picture of vitamin B5 being important for immune function, which is important if you want to talk about gut function.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Now, Amy, can I ask you to indulge me for maybe 4 or 5 minutes? Can I do a public service announcement?
Yes, please.
Are we more or less done with B5?
Yes, I don't have anything. I was looking over my list. I don't.
Okay. If you think of something, let me know. But I think we'll just wrap up by saying it is important. If you
get
are,
your B5.
Yeah,
you get your B5. Well, that's what we're gonna. I think that we should just be really aggressive with people now.
End every episode like that.
Yeah.
But seriously, it's important. I know that the general vibe on the internet and in your nutrition textbooks is going to say that nobody is deficient in this nutrient, but I think probably some people are at least insufficient in it, and increasing B5 as part of doing like your nutritional work might be a part of what helps you. So I hope people pay attention to it and give this important nutrient a little bit more loving. But if I may indulge myself here, my public service announcement, and you know why I'm saying this, is for those of you who are exceptionally nearsighted, aka totally blind without your glasses or your contact lenses, I just wanted to share very briefly from my personal life something that happened. And I was telling Amy, some stuff has happened with my eyes recently, and it just really, really made me grateful that I knew some of this stuff from my training in chiropractic school. And it wasn't like we learned a ton about the eyes, but I remember there was one lecture one day in school, and they articulated, hey, this could be a medical emergency. If you ever see this happen, you need to act quickly. And I took that to heart, and I'm really glad I did. So what happened with me is I started out of nowhere, out of the blue, getting a lot of floaters in my left eye. And it was floaters that I described as looking like wisps of smoke, like wisps of black smoke that kind of covered the vision of that eye. And I thought, oh, that's weird and a little concerning. And it was when I was getting in the shower, I really noticed it the most. And then by the time I got out and dried off, I did a little bit of light Googling, and Google was unhelpful. Everything from, everybody gets floaters, don't worry about it, to your eye might be bleeding. But it went away after about 30 minutes, and there was absolutely no pain. So I was like, all right, I guess I'll go about my life. Then later that night, I noticed when the room was dark, I noticed, every time I look to the far right side of my vision, I see flashes of lightning way off to the far left peripheral part of my vision. And that's when I was like, okay, this is super not normal now. So at 11 o'clock at night, I told my husband, I'm going to go to the ER now. You stay here and watch our kiddo. And I'm really glad that I did, because basically the thing that I remembered from chiropractic school is that these could be early signs of a retinal detachment. And that is a medical emergency. You need to do surgery on it right away to save the vision in that eye. Luckily for me, after going to a couple of appointments and then a retinal specialist, they told me I have some retinal tears, but not a detachment at this stage. So they were able to do like an in-house kind of laser procedure, and hopefully, as my husband called it, they spot welded it in place. They tacked it up so that hopefully the retina will not detach and fall down now. But this is just my little PSA. This is a thing that happens as you get older. You can get basically the goo of your eye, the clear goo in the middle, can detach from the retina a bit. That in and of itself is normal part of aging. But if you're super duper ultra nearsighted like I am, especially this particular eye, then the different shape of your eyeball and these different structure of your retina means that when this goo detaches a bit as you get older, it can pull on the retina and it can damage the retina. And again, like retinal detachment is very, very serious and would need surgical intervention. So if you ever hear somebody say, yeah, I never get floaters, and then just out of the blue today, out of nowhere, I'm getting tons of floaters or wisps of smoke in the eye. Or if you hear somebody say, yeah, I see like flashes of light or lightning way off on the peripheral, edge of my vision, have them get it checked out soon, preferably. And the big holy shit thing that you really need to pay attention for is if you ever hear somebody say that there's a black curtain falling over their field of vision, that's actually like the retina is falling down and it's flopping over like a curtain. So just keep your wits. I'm just really glad that they taught us enough about the eyeballs in chiropractic school that I knew that this was a thing and I knew that it was potentially a medical emergency. And again, I reiterate, not painful at all. Apparently there's no sensory nerve endings in the inside and the back of the eyeball. So I could very much see people going about their daily life, not thinking much of it and kind of thinking, oh, everybody gets floaters. Oh, whatever. But especially if you have multiple symptoms like I did, get it checked out and go to your eye doctor and have them take a look-see-loo in your eyeball and just make sure everything is okay. And again, especially if you are very, very nearsighted. This is my PSA for you.
Well, I feel like at least a lot of the warning signs are like something out of a horror movie, like lightning in the periphery, like the curtain coming down. Like I feel like it's very like dark and spooky. Maybe that's like a better sign that you should do. I don't know.
Maybe. In retrospect, like the the black smoke in the vision, like that did wig me out. And I wish that I had acted sooner because that happened at like 10 or 11 in the morning.
Yeah.
But it went away. And again, it was painless. And I was like, okay, that was weird, but I'm just going to go about my day. Like I had a Q&A to go to for my students and like I had shit to do.
Right.
But I later found out that that was blood that I was seeing in my eye.
Wow.
So that was gross to know that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the more of these symptoms you have, the like higher the risk of retinal detachment is. So I did enough research that I could be informed, like talking to these doctors. But yeah, if you ever hear somebody describe what I just described, and if you know that they are very nearsighted, and again, like as they get older, like I'm only 38, so I'm super young for this to happen too, but that goo detaching, that is a normal thing that happens as we get into like 50s, 60s, 70s.
Right.
So, just be aware. Take care of your eyes. If anything like this pops up, call your eye doctor, have them take a look ASAP. Dilate you, take a look around and just make sure everything is okay. Because for me, if I hadn't acted quickly, it might not have been okay.
Yeah.
And we want to keep our vision, people. The world is beautiful.
Sure.
There are adorable dogs and beautiful flowers and beautiful things that we need to see in this world. So let's try to keep our eyeballs healthy.
I'm so happy that you were able to get the support you needed. And
me too.
Yeah.
I'm grateful, again, that I had enough knowledge to know that this could be a big deal. And
I feel like a lot of people, though, would be real weirded out if, like, probably the first situation where you feel like you were saying you were getting lots of floaters or whatever. I feel like you shook it off because we had things to do, which does happen. But I wonder if I don't know. I don't know if I would shake it off as easy, but I lean more anxious. So I'd probably be like, I'm dying or something. Like death is upon me. So I don't know. It's probably like also maybe more how you're wired to not be as anxious. So yeah, it's funny. I do feel like if something was like doing weird stuff in my eye like that, I would probably be a little more alarmed, at least on the onset. You caught on quick. It's not like you weren't alarmed once more stuff was coming up, but you needed maybe more evidence than I would.
Yeah. The lightning bolts were the final straw. We were doing a movie night, and so I think what was probably happening is I think that the lightning bolt thing was happening for the whole day. But I didn't notice it because it's so bright in the room. And so I think like it wasn't super noticeable because it's way over here in the peripheral part of my vision.
Right.
And it's not like a huge bolt of lightning. It's like, it's subtle enough that I think I didn't notice it during the daytime, but I'm really glad my daughter and I did a movie night that night because the house was pitch dark. We have the whole like theater experience. We put on the good speakers with the subwoofer, and we have the house pitch black, and we usually make popcorn and butter and like the whole 9 yards. And so she asked me to get up 2/3 of the way through the movie and get her a snack. I was like, okay, sure. So I stood up, and when I was watching the movie, my eyes were just focused on the TV straight ahead. So I wasn't really moving my eyes around a lot. But when I stood up and I was walking to the pantry and I was moving around, you're moving your head and you're moving your eyeballs more. And that's when I started noticing in the pitch dark, I was like, ooh, that's super not normal. And what's funny too is that as I was driving to the ER, and to be clear, like I could see reasonably well. I wouldn't have done it if I thought it was unsafe, but we also live like 7 minutes away from a hospital. So it was super quick and easy to get there. But as I was driving to the ER, I kept thinking, oh, is there a thunderstorm on the way? Like, oh, there must be storm clouds over there. I didn't know it was going to rain tonight. And then it kept occurring to me. I'm like, nope, that's your eyeball doing that, man. That's the reason you're going here right now. But there was like 3 separate times in that 7-minute drive that I caught myself thinking, oh, is there lightning over there? Nope, that's my eye. That is my eye. Because again, it was pitch dark and I was driving.
That's wild, Nikki. Wild story.
Wild times. But look out for your nearsighted friends, people.
Yes.
And their weird, long, skinny ass eyeballs and their frail retinas Who knew? But take care of your eyes. Know these warning signs. Hopefully I didn't trigger anybody's health anxiety with this one, but I did feel like a PSA might, even if this information helps one person someday down the line, then I feel like I did my job. So learn from my wacky story. And in the meantime, we will see you next time for another guest episode. And then we will be talking about vitamin B6 as we continue our single nutrient series here on the IBS Freedom Podcast. Thank you for entertaining my foyer into eyeball health. In the meantime, we'll see you back here for more gut health next time you tune in.